I'll tell you what, you'll have a huge surge in planning and planners, so, start that college education thing because you can't hire enough planners and enough land use lawyers.
It strikes me that initially the response and reaction of landowners to Bill 36 and many aspects of the entire package of land bills that are being advanced by the provincial government, the initial response is to identify very specific singular actions, the fact that a cabinet minister can extinguish or now rescind a license, the fact that your land can be frozen under one provision in one of the bills. I think what you've done for us, Carla, is that you've kind of flown over the whole legislative idea that's being advanced in our province, and you're allowing us to look at it from 8,000 or 10,000 feet up, and we can see that the implications are going to be far more profound than a lot of people might be thinking. Colleen, in the meetings that you have been attending with landowners, when landowners speak to you about Bill 36 and the other land bills, are they commenting on any specific aspect of the land bills?
I think that in particular with the people that are affected by the transmission lines and then seeing something like Bill 36 coming in, Cabinet is the base for everything and Cabinet makes all the decisions, that scares the living daylights out of them.
Keith, listening to you and Carla explain the implications here, it strikes me that what the provincial government has embarked upon is a series of laws that not only will alter land use planning, it will certainly do that, but you're really talking about fundamentally redefining how significant aspects of Alberta culture are going to work. Is that a fair statement, do you think?
I think it is. I actually had a call earlier in the week from a member of Parliament in Ottawa, and he was very interested in what's going on in Alberta. And I said, when people start to understand the fundamental change and the powers that the Cabinet's giving itself under Bill 36 and the trend that the other bills that we've talked about, Bill 19, 50, and 24, represent, it's causing Albertans, I've found, in all the travels I've done over the province, to rethink their relationship with government and, more importantly, what relationship government should have with them and their property and their ability to engage in business and participate in markets and so on. And I think Albertans, the message I'm hearing, and hopefully the government's hearing, is that this government's gone way too far in thinking that it knows better than Albertans do about what they need. And they want the government to back off and butt out.
Carla, when you think of the kind of practical impact of this policy on your state, can you give our listeners just an indication of perhaps a family or a rancher or maybe a farmer that has been affected in some way that would enable our listeners to better understand what the practical implications of this kind of legislation might be?
I sure could. And just to remember that our legislation, if you read the initial legislation, it was just to mandate to meet 10 goals that really, when you take them individually, all of us would agree with. But it's the implementation of getting to those 10 goals that has really hamstringed us. And for example, there was a couple early in their years, in their marriage, that decided to invest in buying some land. It was being farmed at the time, but they knew that at that point they were able to subdivide that land, and they thought, let's invest in this land, we'll subdivide it, it'll be a great retirement for us. Unfortunately, about 5 years after they bought it, we passed this piece of legislation that essentially stripped the ability for them to subdivide that land, and it perpetually made it into agricultural land. And it wasn't terribly productive agricultural land. In fact, it was quite hard to make a living off of it. But they held on to it, and in between, we passed a measure that would allow folks that had their property rights removed to at least go into the court system and try to be compensated for those losses. Unfortunately, our government realized that, this is going to be too costly to pay all those rights that we actually stripped away, and we passed another measure that really narrowed the gap of what could be claimed as a taking. What it said is that either you were compensated for the taking or you would be allowed to do what you were allowed to do on your land before the passage of this legislation. So these folks knew that the county would not compensate them. The county said, no, we will allow you to subdivide your land as it was originally intended when you purchased it. In the meantime, we had another piece of legislation passed that significantly limited who would fall under that initiative. And so they were brought to a halt in the midst of building a house. They actually had a house built, but were unable to secure title to the house. They had a cash buyer for that house and were unable to sell it. While they were fighting through our court system to be able to legally do what they can do, they got foreclosed on that house. They spent the entire amount of their retirement. They had no retirement left. They had to take all of their dollars and sink it into battling through the court system to be allowed to do this. In the meantime, while they're going through it, the house was taken. They actually, just a month ago, won their court case. But in the meantime, they spent their entire retirement. They no longer have grade A credit, of which they'd had their entire career, because they had to have a house foreclosed on that they could not sell in the meantime while they were trying to get this through the process. So these folks fought the good fight and they won, but they are not compensated in any way for the loss of their time and their money, the retirement that they had to use to sink in to fight through the court system to win. So they have the right to say we won, but in reality, financially, they've lost dire straits. I feel terribly sorry because they're both retired and now trying to figure out how they're going to have the money to live out the rest of their retirement.
The Oregon experience illustrates that the Bill 36 concept here of centralized planning, the Land Stewardship Act, is a fundamentally flawed concept. You know, Minister Morton, Ted Morton, when he introduced it, was quoted in the newspaper as saying, this is a new concept that hasn't been tried anywhere before. Well, we know that's not true. We know it's been tried in Oregon, and we know variations on it have been tried in Eastern Europe. And to have the politicians in the cabinet room making these magnitude of decisions affecting the whole province and people's land use just shows that the result is arbitrariness and unfairness to people. In response to the concerns, look what the government's proposed to do to amend it. I find it fascinating how we're in a fast motion movie trying to do what Oregon did. One of the measures they brought in Oregon from my research, and Carla can confirm this, is they brought in this idea of compensable taking, that if there's been a taking, you get compensation. Well, what's the amendments to Bill 36 all about, the most recent ones in Bill 10? They brought in this concept of compensable taking. But that concept in Oregon created a whole new set of problems. I think what this underscores is that the whole concept is fundamentally flawed. It's not done anywhere else in Canada. It's not done anywhere in the U.S. except the unfortunate experience of Oregon, and this government needs to repeal the bill.
It's really a situation of unintended consequences that it's led to.
And I think that's exactly the concern about Bill 36, is that Albertans don't dispute the goals. Better land use planning, better integration, cumulative effects management, more flexible conservation tools, careful and wise use of water allocation. Nobody disputes those things. We all share those as goals and values. The problem is that the government sees itself as the ultimate solution, and the more they can concentrate the power in the hands of the cabinet to make whatever decision they want, they think there'll be better decisions that result.
It strikes me that when you look at Bill 19 and Bill 36's companion bills, Bill 19, Carla, is the legislation introduced in Alberta that gives the cabinet the authority to freeze someone's land for even for decades. If cabinet decides that 15 years from now that it may want to use a person's land for some other purpose, it can simply take control of that property and from that point on control what the individual may or may not do, whether he or she could build a shed or a barn. And that piece of legislation, shared with Bill 36, really lays out, I think, what you've described for us in Oregon.
Carla, from your Oregon experience, you've mentioned that there's a linkage between these laws and people's property and freedom.
property rights is essential to any freedoms because it allows a person to dictate what their own future is. They can begin to build a future based on their property and what they choose to dream of doing with that property. It's the creation of invention is freedom, and the foundation of freedom is to have property that you know can't be seized or taken from you by government, that you are in control of that, of your destiny through the ability of creation of wealth through the ownership of property.
Originally, the purpose of the Canadian Senate, which is the upper house in our country, was literally to protect property. In Canadian constitutional law, the notion of property was not written in or protected because it was assumed that the upper house, whose purpose was to protect property, would discharge that function. To be a Canadian senator, you actually had to own a certain amount of real property. It's an interesting tradition that is also deeply rooted in our country. Unfortunately, that tradition has been eroded so much so that there are many people who haven't really had an opportunity to appreciate its implication.
One of the things that I think is interesting in what I'm observing, Colleen and I have been to about 28 meetings now across the province. Over 8,000 people have been out to become informed about this legislation. And it's interesting that even though the government's made an amendment to Bill 36 to take away its ability to extinguish your land title, which should be a no-brainer, what were they thinking in giving themselves the power in the first place? That hasn't fundamentally addressed people's unease and their concern about the legislation. And I wonder whether it's deep down inside they know exactly what Carla just described, our friend from Oregon here, as to the importance of property and the ability for people to aspire to achieve what they can, knowing they have the freedom in what they can do with their property. I really sense that Albertans get this at a very deep level, and that's why we're continuing to see such strong opposition to this legislation and the strong calls on the government to repeal it.
And one thing is to remember that though you may have the right to own that property, if you have no right to use that property as you see fit, essentially you have a dead asset.
Thank you, Colleen and Keith. Carla, thank you so much for your efforts and for the good work of the Cascade Policy Institute. CAEPLA Connections Landowner Talk Radio is sponsored by the Canadian Association of Energy and Pipeline Landowner Associations. CAEPLA is a non-profit association that is not underwritten or sponsored by any foundation or institution, nor do we accept grants from the government. As a non-profit organization, we rely upon the voluntary support of people like you who think this kind of thoughtful and informative approach to landowner issues is valuable. So if you think this kind of programming is worthwhile, we invite you to go to landownerassociation.ca on the internet, click the icon on the navigation bar that lets you take out an associate membership, and then just simply follow that through. We'll end the program this week by leaving you with some ideas that were put forward by Ludwig von Mises, the man many consider to have been one of the most notable economists and social philosophers of the 20th century. He suggested that what transformed the world of horse-drawn carriages, sailing ships, and windmills step by step into a world of airplanes and electronic technology is the principle of private property and of governments leaving people alone. That's it for CAEPLA Connections Landowner Talk Radio. We'll see you next week at the same time.